I feel really compelled to respond to some of the comments this morning. Especially Dr. Richard Dawkins, if he's here. He's, frankly speaking, struck me as a bit of a fundamentalist. And possibly even a bigot. Since he said he wasn't politically correct this morning, I feel that it's okay not to be politically correct too. I was reminded actually when I was listening to that talk of a conversation that I once heard many years ago between the Indian philosopher Krishnamurti and a religious fundamentalist. And at the end of the conversation, the fundamentalist said to Krishnamurti, he said, you know, the more I listen to you, the more convinced I become that you must be an atheist. And Krishnamurti scratched his head, thought for a bit, and said, I used to be an atheist till I realized I was God. And which, of course, absolutely shocked the fundamentalist. And he said, are you denying the divinity of Jesus Christ? To which Krishnamurti responded, heavens, I've never denied anybody their divinity. Why would I do it to Jesus Christ? I think the fundamental flaw in science, even though science is the best thing we have, but the fundamental flaw in the science of yesterday is that it separates the observer from the observed. So here I am, the scientist, looking at the universe from the outside, not realizing that I, the scientist, am also an expression of the universe which I am observing. That's the flaw of science, that it separates the observer from the observed. The idea that there is a designer and a design and a process of designing, and that these are three fundamentally different things, is flawed to begin with. The designer, the process of designing, and the design are actually differentiated expressions of the same underlying reality. In physics, there's an expression that's being used quite a bit these days, and the expression is a tangled hierarchy. A tangled hierarchy is literally that, it's a tangle. In English grammar, for example, the following sentence would be a tangled hierarchy. I'm a liar. So if I'm lying, I'm telling the truth. And if I'm telling the truth, I must be lying. Because the subject qualifies the predicate, and the predicate in turn dictates the subject. And the more physicists look at the fundamental laws of nature, the more compelled they are to speak of tangled hierarchies. Just like the environment we heard this morning polarizes as the organism, it's equally true to say that the organism expresses itself as the environment. The environment polarizes itself as the biological organism. But without the biological organism, there is no environment. It's a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup. The fact that we experience a material world to begin with is based on the nature of our receptors, the nature of our nervous system, the nature of our interneuronal connections. So if a honeybee is looking at a flower, it doesn't see the flower that you and I see. but it can sense honey from a distance because it has receptors that respond to ultraviolet, which we don't respond to. A snake experiences the environment as infrared radiation. A bat experiences at the echo of ultrasound, which means nothing to you and me on a sensory level. A chameleon's eyeballs swivel on 2 different axes. You can't even remotely imagine what this room looks like to a chameleon. So, what's it really like? What's the world really like? And the answer seems to be, it depends on who's looking. It depends on the nature of the receptor, the nature of the interneuronal connections that have structured themselves in response to the environment and the interpretations of a culture, of a history, of spiritual heritage, and so on. Our nervous system and its interneuronal connections is as much an expression of nature as the veins on a piece of granite, or as the colorful designs on the wings of a butterfly, or the pattern of a tornado, or a cyclone, or a whirlpool. That's the fundamental flaw, that we think that these ideas, these creative impulses that seem to emanate from our nervous system are not from the same place from where all design emanates. That these creative ideas that we have are actually as much an expression of the universe and its evolution. Creativity is as much an expression of the universe and its evolution as anything, as a tree or a rock. And the moment we embrace that and understand that, not because of faith or belief, I think faith and belief are a cover-up for insecurity. Because if you didn't have insecurity, you wouldn't need faith and belief. But I think we can scientifically understand that the observer is in fact an expression of the observed. They're part of a tangled hierarchy. The observer creates the observed creates the observer, and just like the same DNA differentiates into messenger molecules and receptors, into sensory apparatus and physical environment, so too, that same underlying deeper reality expresses itself as the observer, the process of observation, and that which is observed. It's just a differentiation into different expressions of itself. And today, biology has not really caught up with the rest of the sciences, because biology is still steeped in the superstition of materialism. All our science and technology today, the fact that you can call me on my cell phone, the fact that you can surf the information highway on the internet, the fact that you can watch television and listen to the radio, all these technologies are actually a product of the climactic overthrow of the superstition of materialism. Because all these technologies are based on a very fundamental premise in science. And that premise in science is that the essential nature of the material world is that it's not material. That fundamental premise in science is that the essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical. That fundamental premise in science is that the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. And not only is it non-stuff, it happens to be thinking non-stuff. So I agree that religions, by and large, have been divisive, they have been quarrelsome, they have been possibly idiotic. But just like everything evolves, our ideas about intelligence are also evolving. And if you don't like the word God, you could easily substitute the word self-referral field of potentiality that generates space-time, energy, information, and matter that is acausal and non-locally, quantum mechanically interconnected. But all you've done is change the semantics. All you've done is change the semantics. And I think I would totally agree that God as a dead white male in the sky is dead, okay? But our ideas of God also evolve as our creativity evolves, which really is what I'm supposed to be talking about. But I think creativity is an expression of your spirit. It's not really an expression, ultimately, even of your mind. The more we look at creativity, the mechanics of creativity, I think, anybody, whether it's a scientific creative process or something that Quincy does or Yo-Yo Ma does or any of the great creative people do, I think they use the word inspired. And the word inspired means to be in spirit. And spirituality is a domain of awareness. It's just a domain of expanded awareness where we feel or experience our universality. I look at the creative process as equally understandable as anything else through the scientific methodology. So today, one of our current sciences that is so successful in the technological worldview that we have is quantum physics. And a few of the very fundamental premises of quantum physics are as follows. The first premise is that at the most fundamental levels of nature, there's no energy, there's no information, there's no space, time, matter, or energy. There is just potentiality. There is just singularity. Space, time, matter, energy, information all disappear into pure possibility or pure intelligence. The second premise of quantum physics, and mind you, if there are academics here, they might take issue with some of my spin on quantum physics, but we can talk about that later. The second fundamental premise of quantum physics is the idea of non-locality, which was first, Einstein was the first one to talk about it. It's known as the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen equation, also subsequently frequently referred to as John Bell's theorem, and recently actually experimentally proved by a French scientist called Alain Aspect. And what the principle of non-locality says is that you can have particles, fundamental particles, in disparate parts of the universe that seem to correlate their behavior with each other instantly. That means faster than the speed of light. A subatomic particle here can communicate with a subatomic particle in another location of space-time, or at least its activities can be correlated so that they seem to know what the other one is doing. As soon as you observe one, you can predict the behavior of the other, which is a very radical idea because as far as we know, nothing moves faster than the speed of light. But this idea of instant correlation is something that biologists are becoming familiar with. For example, when you have creative thought, or when you have attentive sensory processing, or when you're focused on one thing, or when you're having an insight or an intuitive experience, then it seems like disparate parts of the nervous system, they phase and frequency lock in, that the neurons are firing not only at the same time, but at the same frequency, as if the different parts of the nervous system are behaving like they're all instantly connected to each other, faster than the speed of light. And actually, even on a very simple, rational, intellectual basis, for us to see how the human body functions, or for that matter, any biological organism functions, you have to invoke the idea of non-locality. The human body, for example, has about 100 trillion cells, and each cell does several million things per second, and every cell has to know what the other cells are doing. Information and energy transfer would require a lot of time. Your body would fall apart if there was no non-locality. A human body can think thoughts, play a piano, kill germs, make a baby all at the same time. And whilst it's doing that, it tracks the movement of stars because your biological rhythms are actually the rhythms of the cosmos. Your circadian rhythms have to do with the rotation of the Earth. There are seasonal rhythms. There are lunar rhythms. There are all kinds of even tidal rhythms, rhythms within rhythms that are part of the macrocosm. And at every level, the microcosm, the biological organism, replicates the activities non-locally of the macrocosm. The third idea in quantum physics, which is revolutionary, is a phrase that you're all familiar with. It's called the quantum leap, first described by Niels Bohr. And according to that principle, a subatomic particle can move from one location to a new location without going through the intervening space. So it's now here, it's now there, in between, it's nowhere, because in fact, it is non-local. And if you think at the creative process, you'll see that it's literally quantum in nature. It's a pattern of thinking, and then it's a new pattern of thinking with no intervening pattern of thinking, if it's really creative. If it's just, you're just plagiarizing somebody else's ideas, then, of course, it's not real creativity. Real creativity is quantum in nature. It's a pattern of thinking and behavior, and then a new pattern of thinking and behavior with no transitional pattern. Physicists call this a discontinuity, jump, non-algorithmic. And in fact, there's a theorem in physics called Gödel's theorem, after the German physicist Gödel, mathematician. And the principle of Gödel's theorem says that if you have a sufficiently elaborate system of mathematical principles, then within that system, you'll find a principle that's not supported by the system. So you have theorem 1 leading to theorem 2 to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc., an algorithm of mathematical logic, but then suddenly there's a theorem which has nothing to do with the previous theorem. It just appears in the consciousness of the physicist or the mathematician. And when the mathematician looks at it, he says, where the heck did this come from? Intuitively, the mathematician feels it's right, it's true. But he cannot or she cannot explain it through mathematical logic. It's actually a discontinuity. It's a quantum jump in mathematical logic. And since mathematics seems to at least describe the fundamental laws of nature, it's the language that crops up in our consciousness to describe how nature works. And if mathematical logic is creative, then that implies that nature is creative, that there's a creative process going on in nature. I had the good fortune many years ago to sit next to Ilya Prigozhin at dinner in Europe at some function. And I asked him, I said, do you think the universe is creative? He said, absolutely. I said, if it's creative, then is it conscious? And he thought for a bit, and he said, I'll have to think about that. He didn't really answer the question. But creativity implies consciousness, at least to me, that creativity is an expression of consciousness. The fourth principle is I'm going to finish. The fourth principle is, in physics, is the principle of uncertainty, which means you cannot describe an elementary particle as a particle and a wave at the same time. Is it a particle? Is it a wave? Well, it depends on you. If you ask a wave-like question, you'll get a wave-like answer. If you ask a particle-like question, you'll get a particle-like answer. So the observer participates in creating the space-time event, which is the fifth principle, that in the absence of the observer, the universe remains unmanifest. Well, what does this have to do with creativity? That's what creativity is. It's a non-local event that comes from the domain of awareness, which is non-local, which is your soul, which is your spirit, which is the source of the observer, the process of observation, and that which is observed. That domain of singularity, which is most fundamental, the ground of being, which is the ground of everything in the universe. The second principle of creativity, so it comes from there. The second principle of creativity is that there is intention involved. Intention creates the quantum leap of creativity, that it is discontinuous, it's non-algorithmic, it's quantum in nature, and it relies on a progressive proliferation of ambiguity. If you're totally certain about things, then there's no creativity. The more you are willing to embrace uncertainty, ambiguity, chaos, confusion, in that proliferation is the quantum leap. So I know my time is up, and time also comes from the same place of non-locality. What I would like to say in the end is that a religious experience or a spiritual experience is a scientific experience as well. If you're not struck by wonder and curiosity at the magnificence of who you are and your own creativity, if you're not totally perplexed and confused and surprised by the human experience, then your humanity is incomplete. The great Sufi poet Rumi once said, "By God, when you see your beauty, you'll be the idol of yourself, because you'll have gotten in touch with the source of all creation." Thank you.